Welcome, everybody. Today, we're just going to do a whirlwind tour about the science of resilience. And feel free to pipe in with questions in the question and answer. Shakira will interrupt me if something isn't clear. So we'll get going. When we think about the background of why resilience is important, I think the backdrop of what's happened over the past year to year and a half is critical. 70% of workers that were surveyed not long ago said that 2020 was the most stressful year ever. According to the CDC, 4 times as many adults reported depression and anxiety in the middle of 2020. And this one was interesting. Just last month or 2 months ago, a study published by Limeade said that 100% of all employees that were asked about it had a certain amount of stress thinking about coming back to work. What that's done is that's created a level of burnout that is unprecedented. So we're seeing that over 90% of people report some sort of burnout across personal or work or COVID-19. On top of that, we're seeing a scary number from the Society for Human Resource Management that over half of employees are actually currently looking for a new job. So when we think about resilience in the context of what we're facing today, resilience can be defined as a skill or set of skills that help people face challenges, not only by overcoming a challenge, but also learning how to reimagine what's possible so that under new or stressful circumstances, they can thrive. So today I'm going to walk you through some aspects of the science of resilience. Some of it's based on questions that I had, and other is based on scientific papers that I have seen other places. So the first question is, does resilience matter? So how does resilience affect business and individual outcomes? The second is resilience just a side effect of being fortunate? And we'll get into that a little bit. Can we learn resilience? And then lastly, have we seen examples where resilience is protective during the pandemic? So starting with question 1, does resilience matter in business? This is based on a series of studies that were done at Mequilibrium that I was a part of. And it involved 2,000 employed individuals where we cross-referenced their level of resilience with outcomes. And what we see at the high level is that those individuals who were the most resilient up there at the top quartile were less likely to have missed any work days. So 80% had missed no days in the past month. Whereas you get down to the lowest level of resilience, and it was 63%, with 30% missing 1 to 3 days in the past month. When we ask them about their ability to perform at work, we see that those at the lowest level of resilience had 4 times the level of impairment that somebody who had high resilience reported. So while the people who had low resilience, a third of the time they felt like they were impaired, fewer than a tenth of the time for those who are the highest performing. Interestingly, when you ask people about the kinds of physical symptoms that they experience, what we saw was, depending on the score that they had on the resilience scale that Mequilibrium administers to their clients, we see a really dramatic difference between what it is that people experience when they have low resilience and high resilience. So everything from muscle tension to heart palpitations, headaches, sleep issues, gastrointestinal issues, what we see is that by the time you get up to a higher level of resilience score, these symptoms are quite rare, whereas the people who are down toward the bottom have frequent reports of these kinds of symptoms. So it's not just feeling like you can't perform or that you are going to miss work. but you actually experience this somatic level of discomfort. The second big question that I had was whether resilience was a separate sort of a phenomenon. So, for example, I was curious whether if you are really educated, do you just gain enough skills by being educated that you become resilient? Or maybe if you're paid highly enough, then you actually have the comforts that you need to be able to withstand a challenge. So that was my big question. Is it just that you're fortunate enough to have earned your way to resilience or learned your way to resilience? Well, when we looked at it, the correlations between resilience and income, for example, are not statistically significant. They're close. But what was notable is that even those who were the highest paid out of this national sample, 41% of those people had below median resilience. So it's not just that everybody who makes more money is resilient. And the same thing that happened with education. So just because you have an advanced degree, still 44% of the people with a master's degree or higher had low resilience. So it isn't just that you happen to become resilient as a result of these life experiences. And in fact, when you control for age and gender and income and level of education, you still see that high resilience is associated with lower stress, burnout, depression, quitting your job, sleep problems, absences, and positively associated with job satisfaction and productivity. So regardless of earnings, regardless of education, you see this relationship. And in fact, when you look at where resilience has the greatest risk, it was a surprise to us to see that those with low resilience who had a college degree were the highest likelihood of having depression. And on top of that, those who had high resilience were actually more protected. So being college educated made you more at risk of having depression if you had low resilience and less at risk if you had high resilience. So resilience tended to be more protective for those people who had advanced degrees. So in addition to asking whether resilience was associated with education or earnings, I was also interested in whether resilience was just a reflection of whether you worked somewhere that was great to work. So it'd be easy to just say, oh yeah, all our people are resilient, but it turns out it's how the work setting and the work environment experience is. So I'll give you a little background about work environment. If you've never heard of job strain theory is a really cool area of research. And and it was actually developed way back in the 80s. And what the originators of this theory found was that if somebody had a very demanding job, it actually isn't that difficult to withstand, and it's not that stressful to have a demanding job. Unless you have a demanding job, you have very little discretion or control over how to do that job, and you have low social support. High demand, low control, low social support is considered to be a high job strain job. And when somebody has a high job strain job, actually it has severe health consequences, and these have been documented over and over again. You have double the rate of musculoskeletal issues. You have 5 or 6 times the risk of having a heart issue, and you have double the rate of depression. In addition, there are other responses to job strain, which you would expect, and that is that if you're in a high strain job, you are more likely to quit, and you're more likely to be physically absent or mentally check out to try and get out of the stress that's caused by job strain. So the question that we had, that we investigated was, are the people who are in great jobs where they are well supported and they have a lot of discretion about how to do their work, are they going to report high resilience just because it's a great place to work? Or contrarily, if they work somewhere that has really bad job strain, are they going to say they're not resilient? And actually, what we found, again, is that if you control for these things, so regardless of your age, your gender, or the kind of stressful job you have, resilience still has a protective effect. So even in a low job strain job or a high job strain job, it always holds true that high resilience results in lower stress, depression, burnout, sleep problems, and increased job satisfaction and productivity. What's interesting about this also is that resilience seems to be even more protective when you're in a lousy job. So, for example, those who are not resilient, whether it's a high strain or low strain job, they are more likely to experience depression. So this is a tough combination, a high strain job and not resilient. The likelihood of depression is almost 50%. But this difference score between low and high resilience is actually even more protective when you are in a high strain job. So the answer to the first question is no, resilience isn't just because you're working someplace great. It doesn't really matter where you work. Resilience still is a positive characteristic that helps you manage that. But also when you are in a stressful work environment, resilience is even more protective. So low resilience is even more harmful if you are in a high strain work environment job. So the third question that we wanted to cover is whether or not resilience can be learned. There are many studies from maybe the 70s and 80s where there was some original work that proposed that resilience was actually a characteristic that an individual was born with. So this was an inherent ability. Some people were resilient and could handle it, and some people could not. And so the question is that if you hire workers, can you ingrain in them, can you help them develop the kinds of skills they might need in order to be able to overcome the challenges that they face? And one of the ways that you do that is you test how many people are going through training and the amount of training that they undergo. And the study that we did with Mequilibrium for a 2-year period shows what we call the dose response impact, which is that the more training that an individual went through, the more likely it was that they had an improvement in resilience. And so for people who had started at a moderate level of resilience to begin with, the more hours that they spent learning skills, learning to think about their thought patterns differently, understanding how they reacted and how their stress response was influenced by their thinking, the more that they improved their resilience. And probably even more encouraging, those people who spent those hours in training and gaining more resilient skills were likely to report a decrease in how much stress they felt. So as they went through more hours and more in-depth training for how to manage their stress and become more resilient, the more that they reduced their stress. And what we saw was that in the second year, there was even a further decrease for those people who were continually exposed to an intervention like Mequilibrium. So the answer again for question number 3 is yes, you can learn resilience. It isn't simply an innate characteristic. And finally, there is a question that we had about how protective resilience has been during COVID, like other crises. And the first study that I know Mequilibrium did was they looked at changes in how people had reported certain emotional experiences that they had. And they had already measured burnout, motivation, and being positivity in December 2019 before we were hit with the pandemic. And then they remeasured it in June in 2020 and found that people had become dramatically less positive about their life and work. They were dramatically less motivated about their life and work, and they were feeling more burned out during that change in period of time before and after the beginning of the pandemic. But what they also found was that for those with the lowest interaction with the product, meaning the training programs that we had discussed in question number 3, that the less that you were involved in training for resilience, the more you encountered an increase in burnout and stress. And those people who engaged the most in the resilience product, helping them handle the stress, they actually had very little change in sleep issues, job stress, and burnout. And they had a far lower decrease in their level of motivation. So what we notice here is that depending on your training and your level of resilience, you actually experience fewer of the impacts that so many people experienced during COVID. A couple of other studies out in the literature that are relevant to this, and this one was quite dramatic. It was a study of several hundred corporate executives, and they measured the level of resilience those executives had and self-reported instances of depression and anxiety. And what they found was that resilience is dramatically protective. So the executives who reported low resilience had 20 to 25% rate of depression and anxiety, whereas those with the highest resilience had a 5 to 9% likelihood of reporting depression and anxiety. And an additional study that just came out a couple of months ago, where they looked at hotel workers who during COVID were very afraid of their losing their jobs. So the job security issues were huge. And what they found was is the more resilient those workers were, the better they were able to handle the job insecurity and not have the mental health outcomes that are as extreme. And again, this one just came out post-COVID. So we're starting to see this gathering of information, this overwhelming level of evidence about the importance of resilience in the mental health space and in our ability to perform, our ability to handle stress, our ability to reduce the symptomology that happens with stress. So there are several publications that you might be interested in on the website for Mequilibrium, but also out in the literature. The work environment question that I covered was published in 2017, the positive effect of resilience on stress and business outcomes in difficult work environments. The evidence regarding the change in resilient stress and symptoms following training is also available from Journal of Occupational Environmental Medicine. And there's also a summary on the website that gives an overview of almost all of this scientific evidence. So in summary, what we can take from all of these different disparate sources of evidence is that resilience is an asset that is relevant to the workplace. It's related to health, engagement, performance, absenteeism. Resilience is distinct from other factors, meaning it's not simply a luxury that you get from being highly paid, well-educated, or working somewhere where people are thoughtful and supportive. It may be that you are more protected when you don't have these things, but resilience will be an asset whether or not you're highly paid, highly educated, or working somewhere great. Resilience can be improved, and the increase in resilience was related to the amount of time somebody put into it. So it is a skill that is learned over time. And resilience has seemed to have a protective effect, especially during times like these when there's been an ongoing stressful crisis. And those with high resilience showed less burnout, less insomnia, and also, as we saw with the executives, less depression and less anxiety. So that is the end of my formal comments, but I know that Shakira has been watching for questions, and I'm happy to answer questions if they've come up.
Wendy, we do have one question on resources. We have an attendee who would like to do just some reading after everything that you've shared. Do you have any resources that you would recommend for further reading?
Yes. So on the Mequilibrium website, there is a boatload of good resources that you can find on a variety of topics. In addition to that, one of the founders who you may have heard speak earlier today, Andrew Chate, wrote a book called The Resilience Factor, and that is a good resource. There is also a really interesting book by James Clear called Atomic Habits. That is a good resource. And there, as I said, there are many other peer-reviewed studies that are being released all the time. And if you're interested in finding the ones that I mentioned about hotel workers and executives, we can just reach out to Shakira and we can get you those references as well.
Can you touch on what is effective resilience training?
There are so many aspects to this, but I'll put it in a nutshell. The core aspect of resilience training is helping somebody recognize the mental patterns that they have that get in their own way. So, for example, do you, when something bad happens, do you go into a narrative where it's somebody's fault or your fault? When you have an opportunity to think about things differently, do you get into repetitive patterns of your own kind of thinking that don't help you move forward? And all of these things are learnable once you start to recognize your own thinking. And we all have ways that we have a natural emotion that we go to, whether it be anger or defeat or concern or shame. And once everybody starts to understand what those different signature emotions are and the patterns of thinking, you can start to overcome them. And so the basic part of it is all the ways that you can learn to notice those things and begin to take care of your own thinking and take care of yourself through healthy practices as well.
thank you so much to each and every one of you for spending these few minutes with us. And a gigantic thank you to Dr. Wendy Lynch for spending your time with us and for answering all of our questions.